This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 381 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Last week, I talked to you guys about a study that I did on finding league winners in fantasy football. The results told us that, generally speaking, difference makers in fantasy are coming from the early rounds of drafts. It's really hard to find late-round gems, especially a wide receiver. Now, like I mentioned on the show, you could define league winner in two main ways. League winners could be considered players who just far outperformed every other player at their position. That's how I defined it. But you could also see which players exceeded expectation most. Essentially, the most valuable players. Today's episode focuses more on that, but with a twist. A couple of years ago, I did a study on how to spot breakout running backs in fantasy football. Last year, I gave picks on my favorite late-round running backs based on that study. But this past week, I revised the study a little bit. I wanted to update things to see if anything changed. I'll talk through all of that on today's show. We're going to find how you spot breakout running backs in fantasy football, and I'll reveal some of my favorite breakout running backs this season. Now, before getting into all of that, I want to remind you guys to check out the football multiverse. Each week, my colleague Jim Sonis and I were streaming Madden simulations over on FanDuel's YouTube page, and you can build FanDuel lineups based on what happens in those simulations. But what's really fun about it is that each game has a what-if scenario. Upcoming this week is, what if Michael Vick faced Lamar Jackson? So we've got Michael Vick on the Falcons going up against Jackson's Ravens. We've also got a scenario where Aaron Rodgers finally gets a new pass-catching piece with Odell Beckham going to the Packers. But you can make a lineup and play in a free DFS tournament for $3,000 in real prizes. Just go to FanDuel.com/multiverse to enter, and don't forget to watch the live stream on FanDuel's YouTube page starting at 8 p.m. Eastern on Wednesday. Okay, so again, I'm looking at valuable seasons today, not just players who far outperform the rest of their position. It's less about top 10 running backs, which is how league winners were defined on last week's show. Instead, it's about the running backs who exceeded their average draft position the most. That's the process I took when doing this revised study on spotting breakout running backs. I wanted to find who the breakout running backs have been over the last decade or so. And then I wanted to see if there were any shared traits among those running backs. So what I did was, I plotted every running back draft selection since 2011 using MyFantasyLeague.com's average draft position data. Picture on the x-axis a player's overall ADP. On the y-axis, it shows how many points that player actually scored. What this helps us do is find a trend line that shows expectation. So when I plotted those points and made a pretty graph for the article, the trend line showed that a running back who was drafted around pick 50 has generally scored 150 PPR points over the last 9 seasons. A running back drafted 100th overall has scored closer to 100. Now, using that trend line, I was then able to find which players outperformed expectation the most. The top player, the best value at the running back position over the last 9 years, was Alvin Kamara in 2017, his rookie season. He was drafted on average at pick 141. Historically, running backs at that selection scored just under 90 points, but he scored 315. That's a difference of over 225, making him the best value at running back that a lot of you have ever seen, since a lot of you may not have played fantasy football before 2011. So I did this with all running backs. Devontae Freeman's 2015 season was the second most valuable according to this method. Noshan Moreno's 2013 was third best, and so on. And get this, guys. Christian McCaffrey, who was drafted with an ADP of 2.63 last year, he had the 10th most valuable season at the position. He outperformed his ADP at the 10th best rate last year despite having such a high ADP, despite his expectation being insanely high. That's how bonkers his season was. So anyway, we've got this list of players who really outperformed expectation. But like I said in the article, if we're talking about breakout players, we're generally not talking about players with early round ADPs. We're talking later round guys. And since we found last week that the opportunity cost in finding a league winner becomes a lot less significant after round 5 or so, I use that as a baseline. So I looked at all running backs who were drafted since 2011. I found which ones after round 5 or pick 60 in a 12-team league outperform their ADP the most. And by most, I decided on making it 100 points. So all backs after pick 60 who outperform their ADP by 100 or more points. That's our sample of breakout running backs. There were 39 of them. So the question to ask now is, what types of traits did those players share? Were there any trends in this data? Well, clearly, because I'm doing this episode, there were some pretty clear trends. Many of them are the same from the study that I did a couple of years ago, but they're even stronger. There's even more evidence for them. Trend 1 for these breakout running backs is that the vast majority of them were not running back handcuffs. Now, the term handcuff is kind of subjective. You may view someone like Tevin Coleman as a handcuff this year, but I'd say he's not a handcuff since he has standalone value. To me, handcuffs are players without much worth unless an injury happens. They're an insurance policy for the higher-end running backs in fantasy football. Now, regardless of how I feel about handcuffs, among our 39 breakout running backs, it's pretty clear that the vast majority of them were not handcuffs. How do I know that? Well, only 6 of the 39, 15% of them, had a running back teammate drafted in the top 24 of fantasy drafts during their breakout year. And only 3 of them had a running back teammate selected in the first round. And one of those first-round running backs was Le'Veon Bell when he held out for the entire year, so that number realistically could have been smaller. It wasn't a totally traditional handcuff situation when James Conner became a breakout running back. If these running backs were truly handcuffs, we'd see the running back on their team that's drafted before them drafted way higher than we see them. But in truth, of these 39 running backs, the average pick for the top running back in those players' backfields was pick 59. That's the tail end of the 5th round. So the top running back in a breakout running back's backfield is generally selected pretty late. And that brings me to the second trend. Breakout running backs come from ambiguous backfields. The top running backs in a breakout running back backfield is usually selected at pick 59, like I just said. But on top of that, 30 of the 39 running backs analyzed in our sample were the second running back taken from their own team. So you're looking at a situation where these breakout players, and again, they were all drafted after round 5, but 77% of the breakout running backs were not the first running back taken from their own team. In other words, they're players coming from depth charts that are kind of up in the air, where the running back in front of them probably isn't very good. The third trend from the study is that breakout running backs are typically pass catchers. This is a really important one. We know that for a running back to be successful in fantasy football, he generally needs to catch passes. Targets are more valuable than rush attempts in every single format. But what I've found is that the sample of breakout running backs sees a larger proportion of their touches coming via the air. For example, among our sample, the average running back rush share, or the percentage of running back rushes that these breakout running backs had in their backfield, it was 51% during their breakout season. Their average target share was a little over 11%. If you take all of the top 10 running backs and group them together over the last 9 years, while also removing the players from our breakout group, because some of them were top 10 running backs, we see a running back rush share of 70% and a target share of 13%. So the breakout group is much more receiving heavy. When you look at running backs ranked 11th through 20th, it's 58% versus 9.1%. So again, the breakout group is more pass heavy. And you can look at this from a raw numbers standpoint too. And this will probably be more digestible in podcast format and easier to understand. The breakout running back sample had a rush attempts to target ratio of 3. The 39 running backs saw 7,427 rush attempts and 2,472 targets during their breakout season. They had 3 times the amount of rush attempts as targets. For all running backs ranked 1st through 10th that don't include those breakout running backs, the ratio was 3.57. For the next tier of running backs, the RB 11 to 20, it's 4.05. All I'm getting at and showing is that running backs who are breaking out in the later rounds are doing so with an atypical amount of receiving work. They're largely pass catchers. Now, the fourth and final trend is different than it was in the study that I did a couple of years ago. Before, the final trend was that you should be targeting running backs in good offenses. Well, I do think that's still important because there is a correlation between players in good offenses and fantasy success. I think it's less actionable than what this new trend is. The new fourth trend is that breakout running backs are of all ages. a lot of people would probably expect breakout running backs to be young, but that's not totally the case. Among the 39 running backs in our sample, 7 of them were rookies. 6 of them were in year 2 of their career, 7 of them in year 3, 3 of them in year 4, and 6 of them in year 5. Meanwhile, 10 of them were in year 6 or above. I think aiming for youth is fine as a tiebreaker. I don't want this to be twisted into me telling you to just ignore age while you're drafting. But I do think it tells us that we shouldn't just continuously draft rookie running backs or second or third year players just because they're young. And we associate the term breakout with someone who's young. Don't ignore the old guys. So to recap, the 4 trends are that running backs are barely handcuffs, they come from ambiguous backfields, they're generally pass catchers, and they're of all ages. Those are the things to look for in a running back drafted after round 5. Now, in the article that I wrote, I mentioned that I'd be giving specific examples on running backs that I'd be targeting this year on today's show. So that's what I'm going to do. And I won't lie, there are a ton of running backs this season who fit the mold of being breakouts. I think it does play well into the idea that going with a more wide receiver heavy approach, depending on the format, of course, but going with a more wide receiver heavy approach to zig while other people are zagging does make some sense. But again, it depends on your league. I know I just talked about the age thing as something to keep in mind when spotting these breakout running backs, but I also think that we don't always see draft classes like the one we currently have. Not just because they're talented, but because so many day 2 picks ended up going to teams with established running backs in their backfield. What that's done is it's pushed down the ADP for those players a little bit, those rookies, because they're in a committee entering the season. I'm a fan of targeting those running backs even though they're young. And again, the trend isn't to avoid young players and to avoid rookies. It's just that age doesn't really matter. So I'm cool with you guys going with any of the rookie running backs this year as long as you feel good about their pass catching. Whether it's Keyshawn Vaughn or Cam Akers, who I probably like most from a value standpoint of the group, or DeAndre Swift, or even Anthony McFarland or Antonio Gibson. Targeting the rookie running backs who can catch passes or could walk into a role where they're catching passes, it's a pretty good idea this season, because most of the rookie backs ended up falling into ambiguous backfields. But let's move past the rookies. What about some of the veterans? One of the guys who I think fits all of the criteria pretty well is Tevin Coleman. His backfield is ambiguous. That 49ers backfield will likely see somewhat of a committee. And Raheem Mostert, the top back in that backfield by ADP, isn't being selected super high. The situation is really similar to what we've seen from other breakout running backs. Because last year in the regular season, the highest single game running back rush share for San Francisco was under 80%. It was 79.2%. The only team with a lower single game max was Baltimore. In other words, one running back wasn't consistently seeing the running back touches in that backfield very often. Now, maybe that's a knock on Coleman. Maybe the ceiling is capped then. Maybe that's true. But at least compared to Raheem Mostert, Coleman had a target share per game average last year that was almost 3 percentage points higher than Mostert. Now without Matt Breida, it's a little bit easier to see a path to upside for Coleman. I really like him at his cost. I found myself drafting Tariq Cohen this year too. I was off of him in 2019, but he's being selected at RB41 now, and to me, he has a chance to really exceed that cost. You could think of it this way. His overall ADP is 140 according to Best Ball 10's ADP. At 140th overall, we'd expect him to score about 90 fantasy points this year. In order for him to be a breakout according to the criteria that we're using, he'd have to score 190 points. In what many would consider to be a pretty down year for the Bears offense and potentially Cohen in general last year, he scored 163 points. He posted 223 just 2 years ago. He's in somewhat of an ambiguous backfield given where David Montgomery often gets drafted, and he's most definitely a pass catcher. Do I think Cohen will end up being a league-winning running back, a top 10 running back? Probably not. I'm not sure we'll see another 2018 type season, but I do think we'll see him far outperform his ADP, making him a nice value and one that deserves to be called out on today's show. And the last veteran I want to bring up today is the guy who's loved by the fantasy community way more than he is by the teams that he plays for. But that's Duke Johnson. Similar to Tevin Coleman, Johnson's in an ambiguous backfield with a running back ahead of him who's being drafted in the same range as Raheem Mostert. So that side of the criteria fits for him. He's also a pass catcher, and a good one too. Despite not really living up to expectation last year, Duke still had a 12% target share in the Texans offense. Maybe this is the year he puts it together, like his 2017 season in Cleveland. Maybe Houston, with a lot of question marks at pass catcher throughout the offense, utilizes him more heavily than we expect as a pass catcher. I think he's a good veteran to target late. Like I said, though, there are a lot of players you can look at late with this criteria, and I'd love to hear some of your favorites. I don't think the reason you listen to this episode should be for me to just hand you answers. Not only am I likely to be wrong with some of them, but that's not the point. The reason I wanted to use examples is so you could see how to apply some of the things that I talked through on today's show. In the end, we're trying to define our process. We're trying to win at fantasy football in a sustainable way. The only way for that to work is if we have a process that can work year in and year out. We shouldn't be relying on just straight up luck with our late round picks. We should be relying on probability and using methods to increase our chances of hitting. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. I'll be back in your ears later in the week with this week's Mailbag Show.